Fernando Puchol. I work for the Spanish news agency EFE. Mr. Miliband, do you think maybe the expectations on this summit have been set too high, that if we don't get a new Bretton Woods and we solve the world's problems, it's going to be a failure?
Well, I think that we've got to be idealistic and realistic at the same time. The truth is that the depth and breadth of this recession is greater than most people expected. It's challenging to our view of financial markets, but also to our conceptions about how you sustain economic growth. We've deliberately broadened the agenda for the summit to reflect the fact that we're living through an economic crisis, not just a financial crisis. But we've been careful not to raise undue expectations. And I say to you again, one conference on one day doesn't solve all the problems of the world. But what it can do is set a new direction and take concrete decisions that improve people's lives. And that, for us, is the test. Is it adequate to the times in which we live? And remember, Bretton Woods was a multi-year process. Bretton Woods wasn't just a one-day wonder. It was actually a long-term process born out of the horror of the Second World War. And we have to make sure that we take the right decisions on the 2nd of April to set the world on a different path.
Mm-hmm. We're seeing ahead of the summit like two different approaches from rich countries. The US saying that more stimulus, more borrowing should be needed, pumping more money into the system, but European countries saying that it's probably not necessary to do so much so. Do you fear, in a way, that the UK might see itself acting as a mediator on this summit?
I don't see a split between Europe and the United States in this area. European leaders at the special European councils in the autumn and at the December European Council committed themselves to a fiscal stimulus of at least 1.5% of GDP across Europe. That's significant. I mean, the American commitment is a very large one. Different European countries, as the scale of the crisis becomes clear, are committing themselves to reflate their economies. I think that's important. Different countries have sometimes slightly different approaches, but I think that there's a real unity across not just Europe and the US, but actually globally, that we can't just stand on the sidelines. The role of government when markets fail is to step in, and that there is a chronic fall in demand, and that needs to be addressed through government action.
If I may, on emerging countries and protectionism is going to be one of the big issues of this meeting. And when you hear policymakers from emerging countries like in Latin America, and they hear Americans, Europeans talking about we should not protect economies or going to, they can help to raise their eyebrows, like saying, I mean, they have the biggest subsidized and protected economies in the world. What can the rich countries do to avoid this sense in emerging countries? Well,
the message from Britain is very clear, that open trade is in all our interests, and it's in the biggest interests of those in the developing world who have most to gain from a development round, a Doha trade round. We worked very hard last year for a successful conclusion of the Doha round, and the world failed. What it certainly can't afford to do now is relapse into protectionism. Because remember, in the 1930s, the crash of 1929 was a big hit on the global economy. But the response to the crash, different countries putting up barriers to trade, actually compounded the problem and created a global depression. So we can't afford to repeat that mistake, and our commitment to open trade is very clear. I think a number of Latin American countries played a significantly positive role in trying to push on the Doha round last year. Unfortunately, it ended not because of European obstruction and not because of Latin American obstruction, but I think we have to hold fast to the argument that if we fall into protectionism, we'll all suffer.